Today we're talking to Scott Morrison, the Shadow Minister for Immigration, about cities.
That's right.
Scott, population growth, is it inevitable?
Well, it's not only inevitable, it's very important that it happens. And our view is that you need population growth to sustain a certain level of activity in your economy and to create vibrancy in your cities and your society. But at the same time, you need to make sure that population growth is sustainable. You can get too much of a good thing, and when that happens, then I think it very much detracts from the quality of life in your cities in particular, but also it can damage your economy through congestion issues and things of that nature.
And what's the source of population growth in most Australian cities?
Well, right across the country, but particularly in cities, the major driver of growth is immigration. And increasingly, the major driver of immigration growth is not the permanent program, it's actually the temporary program. It's people coming here as students or on working holiday visas, people here on temporary work visas and things of that nature. And our population are the number of people in Australia for 12 months or more over a 16-month period. So the temporary movement of people is becoming a much bigger driver of population growth and impacting particularly on our cities. I mean, you go to Sydney or Melbourne over the last 5 to 10 years, when you're sort of coming across someone who might be from a different ethnic background, it's not likely you're bumping into someone who may have migrated here so many years ago or even is permanently here. They're probably studying.
And whereabouts do they move to in cities, those temporary visitors?
Oh, they tend to be very much in the inner parts of cities, and that's why you've seen, particularly in Melbourne, a lot of the high-rise development and residential has tried to cater to those markets. So these dynamics do have important impacts on cities. They can be positive, but they can be negative.
Okay. So what do you mean by sustainable? I mean, what's a sustainable level of population growth in cities?
Well, take the economy, for example. You need to have a rate of population growth which maintains GDP per capita growth. And Professor McDonald has probably done the best work on this after the last election through the population policy panel process that the government set up, and I'm pleased they did. We forced them to do it. But in that process, he did work which showed that you need a net overseas migration of between about 160,000 to 210,000 a year to ensure that you maintain GDP per capita growth, but also didn't grow it too much that you actually subtracted from it. And so that's what it means for the economy. I think the impacts on the environment are fairly obvious in terms of sustainability, but there are also issues with social cohesion as well. And I think that reflects particularly in cities. Mind you, in regional areas, what you sometimes get is when you get a large group come into a particular regional town or city, that they tend to be very much embraced. And as a result, I think the social cohesion results there sometimes are often better than you would get in a city.
And what is it that makes new population growth and immigration work in established communities? Is there a formula there for making that work?
I don't know if there's a formula. I think what governments have to be is just very mindful of the rate of growth and what they have to do to support that growth. I mean, I don't think people in Australia are particularly worried about population growth for some of the reasons that are put about that try and sort of attack those who have concerns about population growth. I don't think it's got anything to do with race or xenophobia or anything like that. It's actually got a lot to do with resources. It's got to do with traffic jams. It's got to do with infrastructure. It's got to do with water. It's got to do with utilities and infrastructure. And people, I think, are fine with population growth, but you've got to build it so they can come. And too often they come and nothing gets built, and as a result, people get quite irritable, to put it lightly.
Do you think we can direct population growth to the areas where there's jobs growth? And so there's not thinking so much now about the larger cities, but there are regional cities, if you like, and towns that have got a lot of demand, Gladstone in Queensland, and places like that, driven by resource investment. Can we direct population growth into those areas?
I think you can have an impact at the margins in the migration program, but you can't be King Canute on these things. Centuries of settlement patterns dictate that people go where the jobs are, and that's predominantly in our major cities. I mean, even with the growth in the West, which we know their economy is growing at above and beyond the rates of our Asian neighbours in Western Australia, and Queensland not as much. Still more than half of even our temporary business migration is still going into New South Wales and Victoria. And what you can do though with temporary migration, and I think the big change in the migration program is that because it's more temporary than permanent, governments can put more conditions on temporary migrants. They can stipulate occupations they should work in and must work in. They can stipulate what regions they can work in, and there are regional migration programs that reflect that. So I think we can tailor it a lot more. But at the end of the day, you're really working at the margins, not the core. And if you want to get people to move, then you've got to give them a reason to do it, and that's called a job.
Well, there are lots of jobs, but there's a whole debate about whether there's been enough labour mobility in Australia. Do you see any barriers to that?
Well, I think there are lots of them. You compare it to the United States or Europe or places like that, then people do tend to move around. And we don't do that here. And I'd even argue people are even more mobile in New Zealand than they are in Australia. And the distances, as you know, in New Zealand are just as great in many cases, but there does seem to be a bit more mobility there. It's cultural, it's historical, it's tradition, it's I think something in the Australian psyche that we haven't yet worked out how to crack. But ultimately, it comes down to, if we are going to be successful, then there has to be opportunities in these places, and people have to see communities in those places. I mean, one of the things when I go up to places like Weipa, and you go into these FIFO communities, and you see basically the collapse of towns, and you see a lot of divisions between the fly in fly out population and the resident population, and the tensions that exist, and these places can be quite unsettled, and that's very concerning. I think we've gone down this path, and there's currently a parliamentary inquiry looking into this and the impacts of it, and I think I'll wait with interest what they come up with.
So people want more than a job; they want a life.
But exactly, communities. That's what happens in communities. That's why people want to live in them, and they don't want to move too far from family and things like this. So, I mean, they're largely personal decisions. I'm not one for directing people's personal decisions. They can make up their own mind. We've just got to create an environment where that choice is at least rationally a viable one.
Good. What about the role of the Commonwealth in cities? I mean, on one hand, the Commonwealth has the money. You control immigration policy, which affects population growth. But on the other hand, it's the states and local government that have the responsibility for accommodating growth in cities and building infrastructure and all the rest of it. What's the right role for the Commonwealth in development of cities?
Well, I think first of all, they've got to stick to what they do. And when they try to work outside the lines on this, it just creates confusion and false expectations that never get met. And the primary things that the federal government needs to do is the management of the economy. It needs to, and that relates to all aspects of economic policy, whether it's productivity policy, employment policy, and so on. Migration policy, they obviously have carriage over that, and sometimes you get state governments like Bob Carr used to. So, Sydney's full, we're going to shut it down. Well, he didn't have the keys to the door. That was a federal government responsibility, and so their failure to plan for infrastructure, I think, created those tensions because people kept piling in. But you're right, we also spend money. And that's probably where the leverage and influence is most opportune. I mean, this government seems to pretend that the federal government has laid every brick that's gone into a building over the last 5 years, and that's obviously nonsense. The Commonwealth is not a big funder of infrastructure. It's not a big funder of major projects. That's done principally by the private sector, but also most predominantly in the public sector by state governments and local governments. We fund them, we partner with them, there's the COAG process, and particularly there's the local government grants that are provided of over $1 billion a year. Now we shell that money out as a federal government and ask for nothing in return. Absolutely nothing. No reform, no plans, no integration, no greater efficiency. Here's some more cash.
And some of the best reform programs in the last couple of decades have really been where the Commonwealth has reached agreement with states on reform and then provided funds to support that. So national competition policy, energy reform, etc. Is that a model do you think we could extend into development of cities and infrastructure?
Well, speaking personally rather than on behalf of the coalition, I've always been and long been a fan of that idea in the area of reform within government. And I was a big fan of the competition reforms that went past, and they were a big driver of productivity. And I think we've got a bit shy from those sort of things in more recent times. But if we do want to get the change in local government, and if we do want to get the focus on priorities at the state level, then how the federal government spends money and the conditions on which it does it, Well, they're relevant. I mean, I'll give you an example. You go and say you're going to put, several $1 billion into a major road work in whatever state, or a port or something like that. It always puzzles me that investment is never a part of an agreement that the state government will be investing in other aspects of infrastructure which support that particular piece of infrastructure, or local governments aren't doing something as part of that arrangement to be zoning particular parcels of land or things of that nature, which means the money the federal government spends is multiplied many times by its integration with other arms of government. I mean, it's all done as one-off drops, and I think when you look around the country, you certainly see the result of that.
Yeah, that's what's come out recently out of the Co-Ag Reform Council's report. Look, just asking, turning personally, I mean, what is it? I know that you're a Sydney boy and obviously live in the Cook electorate now. But where you grew up in your neighbourhood, what was it about your neighbourhood that was great?
Oh, as a kid, it was just the ability to move around safely, frankly. And we lived by the beach as we do now down in the Shire. And the ability, to basically live the life you want to live, and access the sort of parks and services and entertainment and things you want to have as a family or as a young person. I think that's really what it adds up to. I mean, as a father now, things that are important to me are schools that kids are going to go to, and where they're going to knock about with their friends. But I think increasingly in cities around the country, a sense of personal safety and security is really important. I mean, I don't want to see Sydney or any city get to that sort of walled cities sort of concept that you see in other parts of the world. You want it to be an open place. You want it to be a cohesive place, and so I think law and order is a big issue for cities, and that's predominantly a state issue, and that's why I've always been a strong believer in strong policies in that area.
Yeah, it does seem to be a common theme of discussion amongst parents of our age. About whether our own children have that same personal liberty and freedom to move around the city that we had when we were young.
Absolutely. You used to, trundle off and kick the footy down the park, or play, soccer on the nature strip or something like that, or ride your bike wherever you wanted to. I mean, these days, I think you're a lot more worried about those sorts of things happen. Maybe the risks were just as bad back then. We were just oblivious to them. But I think, though, today, one of the big issues for that is traffic on roads. I mean, when we were kids, there were just not as many cars on the roads, and as a result, there were fewer accidents, and there was lesser risk. Now, if there's one thing that does drive me crazy is that when I see carhoons, ripping up my street, which is just a small suburban street in southern Sydney, there are kids around there. Any of them can get knocked over any time. So, we've got to be very mindful of each other in our communities, and if a community can do that, it'll be a place where people want to live.
It's a mutual responsibility.
Yeah, it's not all about government. I mean, half the time we've just got to, keep each other honest about these sort of things. The great thing I love about living in the Shire is that there is that sense of community, apart from the old Hume running up the road in their car. But everyone looks out for each other, and people look after each other's kids. We help each other when there's a problem or something like that. That's, at the end of the day, the heart of community, and governments can't legislate that. That's culture.
Yes, that's the big question. How do we generate strong communities in cities?
Oh.
Well, one thing I wanted to ask you too, I know you've travelled around a lot. I mean, what are the cities, and I'm not necessarily thinking of Australian cities here, but what are the cities in the world that you think are really effective, vibrant cities, and why do you like them?
Well, I actually spent a bit of time, as you know, living in Wellington, as you did. Now, that was a much smaller city. It was compact, and it was much more accessible. I think the best cities are walking cities when you're talking about the inner areas of the city, and that's something which you always look to. I mean, great cities, I've walked around places like Buenos Aires are just brilliant, and they're beautiful, and they're by the water, they're by the sea. It's just breathtaking, and the weather obviously plays into all of that. But as you move around the world, frankly, you always want to come home, and I think that's why Australians are so passionate, and eventually do come home after they've had their journeys, because they know this is where they can find a place which suits their lifestyle, suits their character, is a place where you really can bring up kids and raise a family in the way you'd like to, and give them the lifestyle that you've always aspired to.
I think there's a Peter Allen song about that, actually.
There probably is. I don't have the rights to that one.
Yeah, and I agree with you on Wellington. It is a great city.
It is.
Scott, thanks for talking to us today.
Thanks, Simon. Good to see you.
Yeah.